The famous writer Barbara Kingsolver never intended to have a pet hermit crab. But when she got back from her vacation in the Bahamas to her home in Tucson, Arizona, and she poured the collection of shells she had gathered out on the kitchen table so her daughter could look at them, one of them began to crawl away. So what else could they do but put it in a tank, start feeding it leftovers, and name it Buster? For a while they watched Buster, this crab, and its rhythms of activity absolutely perplexed them. Sometimes it would seem to go into periods of dormancy where it would do nothing. It was almost dead. It seemed depressed, lifeless. And then for no apparent reason, it would become hyperactive and bustle all about as if it had become manic. This rhythm had absolutely no rhyme or reason, and they couldn't quite understand it until Kingsolver remembered an article she had read when she was studying to be a biologist. In 1954, a scientist named F.A. Brown was studying the internal rhythms and the activity of oysters. He gathered some oysters from the Connecticut coast, where on the coast they would open their shells and eat, and then close their shells according to the tides there in Connecticut. He gathered some of these oysters and took them to a basement laboratory in Chicago to observe them. Now, for about 2 weeks, these oysters in unison continued to open and close in rhythm with the tides in Connecticut. But then something changed that puzzled the researchers. They continued to open and close in unison, but their rhythm had changed. It was no longer in accordance to the tides in Connecticut, nor to the tides in California, or to the tides in any place else on earth that had an ocean. They were puzzled until they had an idea. And they did some calculations and discovered that the oysters were behaving in accordance with high tide in Chicago. Never mind that they were in a basement and Chicago doesn't even have oceans. And it occurred to Kingsolver, this crab Buster, its activities of dormancy and rhythm must be marking out high tide in Tucson, high tide in the desert. And its activities in this tank of rhythm and of dormancy, this crab living by high tide in Tucson, becomes for Kingsolver a metaphor. It becomes a metaphor for the rhythms of human life. Those deep rhythms that shape so much of our living, even when those rhythms seem useless or ridiculous or perhaps even destructive. She gives an example. She writes, "We humans have to grant the presence of some past adaptations, even in their unforgivable extremes, if only to admit they are permanent rocks in the stream we are obliged to navigate. We are persistently, excruciatingly adept at many things that seem no more useful to modern life than the tracking of tides in a desert. At recognizing insider-outsider status, for example, starting with white versus black, and grading straight into distinctions so fine as to baffle the bystander, Serb and Bosnian, Hutu and Tutsi, Crip and Blood. We hold that children learn discrimination from their parents, but they learn it fiercely and well, world without end, recited by rote like a multiplication table. Take it to heart, though it's neither helpful nor appropriate. The preference for the scent of our own clan. 1,000 anachronisms dance down the strands of our DNA from a hidebound tribal past, guiding us toward the glories of survival and some vainglories as well. If we resent being bound by these ropes, the best hope is to seize them out like snakes by the throat, look them in the eye, and own up to their venom. It's a powerful image. The human preference for the scent of our own clan. The living our lives in accordance with the rhythms of discrimination and division that we learn so rapidly and tenaciously as children. Living according to the tides of insider and outsider status. Maybe Kingsolver speculates that these had uses in some hidebound past, but today they are as useless as a crab marking high tide in the desert. Not only silly, but pernicious. I was reminded of this image this week and how we, even in Durham, still live our lives shaped by the tides and rhythms of discrimination and division. I was reminded of this image when I read on Wednesday morning in the newspaper about the groundbreaking for the development of the Rolling Hills area in what used to be the Hayti community southeast of downtown Durham. Did you read about that on the front page of the paper? I noticed it because both the radio report and the newspaper very briefly mentioned the history that makes this redevelopment necessary. Here's what the Herald Sun said on the front page. Much of Hayti was demolished to make way in the 1960s and the 1970s for the construction of what is now the Durham Freeway. There's a lot of history and a lot of hurt in that line. Because the Hayti community in Durham, as many of you know, was a thriving black cultural and economic center, not just in Durham, not just in the state, but in the nation. It was nationally known as the Black Wall Street, an area of success that was made necessary by segregation laws. As one article I read talked about the vigor of Hayti and its triumph in the face of institutional racism. Its triumph. Triumph, that is, until, as the newspaper said, much of the Hayti community was demolished in the 1960s and 70s to make way for what would become the Durham Freeway. The reason there is redevelopment now in that area, and the reason that area has suffered such economic and social deprivation, is the same reason so many of us can get to Duke Memorial and downtown Durham so easily, the Durham Freeway. A vital area of Durham was destroyed 60 years ago, the Hayti community, so that another area of Durham, downtown, could be revitalized after whites began moving to the suburbs in the 1950s and the 1960s. Durham is paying today for the revitalization of an area that was destroyed 50 years ago when it was vital then, so that a declining area, the downtown, could be revitalized. Now, of course, the residents of the Hayti community have been paying for that move in countless ways for the last 50 years. This is obviously a very complicated history. But anyone who knows just a fraction of it knows that the ropes of racism and discrimination and class are inextricably woven through this history. And it's just one example, the Hayti community and the Durham Freeway. One example, we could each think of 10 others. 10 other ways our lives today are still shaped by these rhythms of discrimination and division. The rhythm of race and class, of us and them, of red and blue, of legal and illegal. Even when they have no meaning or use for us today. We seem to be no better able to escape them than a crab can escape the push and the pull of the moon. who knows where these rhythms come from? Biologists and anthropologists and sociologists and psychologists and even some daring theologians have their theories. But one thing is clear: they are deep. And a biblical truth is just as clear. It's not the way it's supposed to be. That's the biblical story Paul is trying to tell in this very dense letter to the Ephesians. The story of how God used these rhythms to overcome them. Because God's goal is a unified, united, single humanity joined in the praise and the worship of God. That's God's goal. And in order to achieve this goal, God chose the Jews. Hang with me here. In order to achieve that goal, God chose the Jews and separated them from all the rest of the people in the earth that we call Gentiles. And God gave these chosen people the gift of the law. The law taught them how to worship God, to make sure that they were worshiping the right God. The law separated them from other people so that they could be holy and know how to live in ways that were pleasing to God. These chosen Jews became the stewards, the custodians of God's ways and purposes in the world. Let me offer an analogy that might help to make some sense of that. God created humanity to dance with God and to dance with other people. But when humanity sinned, we forgot the moves to God's dance. We decided we would rather dance on our own and frankly dance with people like us. So God chose the Jews, a people who would relearn God's dance. God said, I want to dance with you and I want you to dance with me, and here's how you're going to know the steps of the dance. And God gave them the gift of the law. What a gift. So the Jews became the stewards of God's dance in the world when everyone else had forgotten it. Now, the ultimate purpose was that these people would learn the dance and practice the dance, and eventually one day invite others into the dance so that all people might once again know how to dance with God and with others, because you can't dance with God if you're not willing to dance with others. So that God's goal might be fulfilled, that a united humanity might dance again in joy with God and with other people. But as the biblical story goes, those people forgot this purpose. They began to believe the dance belonged to them and to them alone. They began to care more about getting the dance exactly right and keeping others off the dance floor who might mess it up than they did about the coming day when humanity and God would experience joy, when the dance would be opened up and all people would be invited in. As it was, knowing the dance marked them as God's people and others as not God's people, and they were just as happy to keep it that way. That's why Jesus was such a scandal. The chosen people's Messiah who would dance with anyone indiscriminately. He would teach God's dance to anyone, insider, outsider, us, and them. As Paul says, he came to break down the dividing wall. He came to create what Paul calls a new humanity. Not the old divided humanity, the humanity living by those deep rhythms of discrimination and division, by the internal rhythms of fear and mistrust, but a new united humanity, a humanity dancing with one another and with God, dancing to the rhythm of God's heartbeat and to the tune of God's song. And Paul calls that salvation. Paul calls that the gospel. It's salvation because To use King Solva's words again, we weren't able on our own to grab that snake of division by the neck and look it in its eye and own up to its venom. We had been poisoned. But Jesus could. And Jesus did. Jesus grabbed the snake by the throat. And it bit him. And when its fangs sank into his flesh, it felt like nails in his hands and his feet. And its deadly venom coursed through his veins. But when God raised Jesus from the dead, he became living proof that the ways of the snake were at an end. And he created in himself a new humanity, a new social reality, a new thing on the earth called, hold on to your seats, called church. That people in the world learning again to dance with God and with others across lines of difference we thought were impossible to breach. That's what Jesus did. Now, it seems to me we can respond in one of two ways. We can say, that's ridiculous. Are you telling me in order to be reconciled to God, in order to dance with God, I have to learn to dance with people who are different from me? I have to learn to share my life, and as a church, we have to learn to share our lives across these divisions of race and class and nationality? No thanks. I like the rhythms of my life just as they are. I like the dance steps I already know. That's one response, and it's the default response. But the other response is this. We can say, we are a Durham church, and we are God's church. And Durham has lived for too long according to these rhythms of discrimination and division, and we will not allow those rhythms to determine the shape of our life. We will not allow ourselves to continue to be poisoned by this snake's venom, but we will allow ourselves to become the new humanity, the humanity Jesus saved us to be, even if that means we have to learn some new dance steps. Even if we have to eat lunch, for instance, on the lawn and play games in 104-degree weather as we did 2 weeks ago. Even if that's the step we have to learn in order to dance with our neighbors who live on the other side of the Durham Freeway, we'll do it. Even if we have to learn the dance step of working in a community garden in the West End with friends we haven't even met yet. Even if we have to watch the opening festivities of the Olympics, not in our own in-home theater systems, but here in the church with refugees from around the world. We'll learn these dance steps, we can say, if that's what it takes to be the new humanity God created us to be. We will even more deeply invest in getting to know our neighbors because our neighbors have been strangers for too long. We will learn to dance to the rhythm of God's beat and to the tune of God's song. You know this. When Washington Duke and a few others founded this church 125 years ago, Washington Duke said it should be a church for the masses. And he had in mind a church where the divisions of class were overcome and rich and poor worshiped God together in one body. That's what he had in mind. And that meant these Methodists in Durham 125 years ago had to learn some new dance steps. Worshiping in a tobacco warehouse instead of a fancy church on Sunday morning, that was a new dance step they were willing to learn. Inspired by this beginning, if we want to continue to be a Durham church that grows up into that new humanity God wants us to be, then we will continue to ask these kinds of questions relentlessly. how does that division of class and what other divisions continue to need to be healed in our community? What dance steps do we love so much, but that keep us separated from others? Who are we afraid to get on the dance floor with, and why? And what are we willing to do to overcome that fear? What new dance steps are we willing to learn? We can ask these questions because Jesus has already overcome the divisions. As Paul says, he has already broken down the dividing wall. These divisions go deep, but they don't have to determine our lives. That's the gospel. We can live by other rhythms. We can live to the rhythm of God's beat. We can dance to the tune of God's song. But if we're going to do that, live to God's beat and dance to God's song, we're going to have to pray. God, pound your rhythm out in our ears so we can hear it. And don't stop singing your song in our hearts. Jesus, teach us to dance. Amen.